Hi, everyone. Welcome to NiCHE Conversations, where I speak with NiCHE contributors about the work that they've published on our website. And today we are going to be talking about death and corpses and colonialism. And Jessica's already joined us, so I'm going to invite her in.
Hi.
Hello. Hello, Jessica.
So I'm just setting this up very precariously, but hopefully it stays there.
Yes. Welcome to NiCHE Conversations. I'm Jessica DeWitt, one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I am joined by Jessica Elkaim. And do you want to tell us more about yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me, inviting me to chat and for hosting this series, which is very cool. I'm excited to talk about death. There's nothing more uplifting to start your day than a little chat about corpses.
Yes.
So I am a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in English literature, where I study historical and contemporary figurations of the corpse in American culture and literature, more specifically. Basically, my dissertation argues that the corpse was a key figure in the development of American literature, through whom a lot of writers confronted the politics of personhood. And I also kind of try to reflect on the epistemological gaps that have been created by modern North American society's alienation from the corpse now.
Mm-hmm.
And I use the corpse as a lens for analyzing a lot of social justice issues and inequalities that are related to race, class, and gender, and especially entanglements between the body and their environments.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, the post that I wrote for NiCHE is taken from a chapter and hopefully a forthcoming publication where I compare the rhetoric of the Green Burial movement today to material depictions of Indigenous remains in early frontier novels. And the goal was really to kind of demonstrate that the colonization of Indigenous bodies as extractable resources in the literary imagination continues nowadays to mark these communities today as unsustainable.
Mm-hmm.
So I see this kind of work as intervening into the role of academia today, where all our systems are collapsing, to kind of show that a lot of these humanities-based approaches can maybe help foster literacy about necropolitics and how that's still limiting our responses nowadays to emergencies like the climate crisis. That was my long introduction.
Yeah, no, that's like a fantastic explanation of your work, and it's so cool. I'm so excited to talk more about it today with you. And we published back in August, I believe, is when we published your piece, which was called Corpse Ecologies, Land Rights and the Colonization of Corpses.
Mm-hmm.
So
a really easy title. Yeah.
Okay, and it was very popular with our readership, so it struck a nerve, and I think this is a topic that is getting more and more traction, right? So first off, as you mentioned in your piece, you think and talk a lot about dead bodies, and you just explained your research topic. So I thought we'd start off by just like, how did you get interested in this topic? How did you find yourself writing a dissertation on it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question I get a lot from my family, especially, who want to know why I think and talk a lot about dead bodies. I mean, I think the obvious answer is like, most human beings, I'm very tormented by the idea of my own death and the idea of becoming a corpse. I think I find it really weird to think that like I am my own corpse right now, and I find that very strange and alienating. And I think doing this kind of research helps me cope with that by trying to understand corpses differently. And I think that in a narrative world, you kind of get to see bodies as being much more magnetic and having this strange and very strong effect on us, even as just literary characters. And so I'm trying to see like if depending on how we view the dead and how we represent the dead or relate to the dead or love the dead or dehumanize them, we get to actually learn a lot about ourselves. They become these sort of reflective surfaces that teach us about ourselves and teach us about the living. But I'm also interested in thinking about dead bodies on their own terms, not always just in relation to the living. And I actually initially was planning to do a PhD that looked at non-human agents in contemporary novels, and I'm very glad I'm not. I think the world should be happy I'm not doing that that dissertation. But that's sort of what my interest kind of naturally shifted to dead bodies, because they're kind of these hybrid figures, and they're, they straddle the line between object and object. Ontologically, we kind of never quite know what they are, and I was curious to kind of understand if a corpse can be a character, and how maybe as a character it sort of helps to redefine our notions of personhood that are even infiltrated in like narrative theory, right? Characters are usually living characters, right? And so it sort of helps us to question, why it is that we think that way. And I was interested to see if they can kind of, how they occupy narrative space. Can they drive a story? What happens to the story if you start looking at these neglected figures in the corner? Like, are there different kinds of pockets of drama happening, in that decentralize the main story, where you can, and there's a plurality there, because there's usually a lot of corpses in a novel. There's never just one character. There's usually one hero, one central protagonist, but there are multiple corpses. There's a sense of like collectivity and plurality that's associated with corpses. And then I became especially interested in the 19th century American literature, because there's a high concentration of corpses in American literature. It's basically just a graveyard. There's a lot of them in medieval literature too. Obviously, they loved death too. But that would have required me to like learn Old English, and I'm really too lazy for that. So, so I focused on the 19th century American context, and I was interested to kind of think about, why are there so many hordes of corpses in the 19th century? What are some of the ideas that these writers were wrestling with? What's the historical background for this? And I think it mirrors our own in a lot of ways. It's a time of really profound turbulence in terms of new confrontations with death. There's a lot of urbanization and migration from the country to the city, which prompts a lot of reorganizations of burial spaces and practices. There's rapid industrialization, so there's new forms of exploitation. So people are dying differently and at a higher rate and higher concentration. There's new media like photography, which changes our affective relationship to death and how we process it. And then you have things like embalming, which become normalized after the Civil War. And then that leads to a new class of death specialists that didn't exist before, who were charged with, who become funeral directors, right? Like that's sort of the birth of the professionalization of death, which institutionalized and sanitized death in a way that we still see today. So that's sort of the context that got me really interested in this, and seeing those continuities today, right? I think we have a lot of our own capitalist accelerations now, and technology and climate and crisis and wars that are also confronting us with death in a new way, where it's getting a lot more abstracted behind like a digital denial of our own corporeality, right? So it becomes easier to kind of not think about what's going to happen to you after you die. So yeah, I think it's creating different kinds of hierarchies today around corpses and death, but that I think we can learn about those hierarchies in these texts in the 19th century. I think like those corpses have a lot to teach us about our own relationship with death in the 21st century.
Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah. I mean, for me, like as an environmental historian, I do love the way that the corpse really is at that point where it really highlights how part of nature we are. And it in some ways, some of the, modern burial practices are kind of really pushing back at that moment, like, no, I am not part of the earth. Like, I'm going to be in the $20,000 casket that will, keep me separate from, like, and I love, I think it's just, it's at a point where you're like, no, we die. Like, we die.
The really interesting thing, which is something I learned doing research for this particular chapter, was that it weirdly enough, like our modern practices, which is now the thing that a lot of the Green Burial movement is pushing against, like embalming and the chemicals and the artificial kind of preservation of the body, those actually kind of emerged out of a weird kind of environmental consciousness in the 19th century. There's this idea of trying to clean and purify the body before burying it, and that the body would create more pollution if it was buried naturally. And so it was trying to sanitize it for environmental reasons, weirdly enough.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Cool.
And so it's strange that, and even like our concept of cemeteries today and the way that we bury people also comes from a kind of green movement at the time to create more continuity between citizens and the earth, weirdly enough, to kind of re-immerse them in a natural world, even though everything about it is completely artificial. But
fascinating. Cool. I did not know that. And that's, like, I would not associate that with being like environmentally, like our concept of our relationship to environment. Like, this is just showing how it evolves, and it evolves fairly quickly too, right? And I also appreciate that you're pointing out like your personal relationship to the topic, because I think all of us have a complicated relationship with death, and I like to think of myself as very, educated and nuanced on a topic. But if I really sit with it, and think about like my last like moment or something, panic ensues.
And I think a lot of this, especially looking, digging into, I liked your description of this, like if we're going to dig into this topic. I think it came a lot from trying to figure out for myself, what do I want to happen to my body? I mean, it's actually a question I didn't ask myself for many years when I started working on this project. And then it just kind of hit me, like, I haven't been thinking at all about what I want to happen to me. And I'm doing all this research into this topic. And then I started looking into all the different burial methods or alternative modes of burial that exist now, and realizing just how, because you think, well, I'm going to go for something sustainable. I'm going to opt for a green option. That's the last thing I can do for the planet, is to minimize even my death print. But there really are no good options out there. And that's sort of what got me interested in thinking about the environmental movement around corpses, and how urgent of an issue is it that we think about this. And I do think that it is, especially after the pandemic, when there was such a high rise of cremation around the world. And cremation is a huge source of pollution, and it remains the most popular form of body disposal in the world. And so it makes sense to start to think about sustainable options. And I think the green burial sounds good on the surface, but there's other options. There are really wild alternatives out there nowadays. There's things like extreme funerals, where you can be like embalmed doing like an extreme sport or something that you really like doing, like on your motorcycle, which sounds fun. There's drive-through funerals now. There's all kinds of memorial art. They don't call them urns anymore. They call it memorial art, because there's just such a variety of ways that you can be preserved and displayed in your family's house afterwards. There's aquamation, which is it's water cremation, essentially. Another option I learned about recently is that your cremains can be buried in with a coral reef project, where, and that sounded nice. I think that sounded nice, but then you start thinking about your family has to travel to Hawaii to bring your cremains there, and you still have to be cremated, And I'm not sure that your cremains actually do anything for the environment. I think it's more of a symbolic gesture. So again, that seems, and I mean, there's all the pollution costs associated with you traveling to Hawaii to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's a weird industry.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, so let's turn a little bit to the literature.
Mm-hmm.
So in this piece, we're talking about early American literature and 19th century literature. So how does this literature contribute to establishing hierarchies of death? Mm-hmm. And how is this connected to colonialism?
Yes. So, I mean, I think I've been in all the texts that I look at, I'm interested in how corpses are made visible in these texts. So how are they gendered or racialized? What forms do they take? And then you start quickly to realize that some different types of corpses are afforded different, more or less humanity, different rights, different care, different forms in these novels. I mean, in real life and literature, and those spheres obviously overlap and reinforce one another. And so obviously oppressed communities like Indigenous peoples and racialized communities in Canada and the US have been systematically viewed as unmournable and kind of already dead subjects, even in 19th century literature. And then you start to notice how American literature, in the way that it represents certain bodies, controls the biopolitics of grievability. It kind of, because it encourages its readers to decide who's mournable and who isn't, based on the way that it represents these bodies. And the thing that's really interesting about frontier novels is that it creates a kind of sentimental colonialism where it encourages readers to mourn Indigenous communities as already dead in a way that clears the way for the American nation, because it's kind of saying like, look, no, there's nobody there anymore, and look how sympathetic we are about what happened, but now, you know, they have entrusted us now as the new stewards of this land and this nation. And so it kind of uses this death as to fertilize the American dream and to enable this kind of transference of identity between settlers and the Indigenous communities. I think like a good example of that, that I'm sure most people would know, at least from the movie, is like The Last of the Mohicans, is a really great example of that, of like the transfer of identity between the main character and the Mohican chief, where the main character, Hawkeye, even has like a very indigenized name. He kind of harbors even more traditional Indigenous beliefs and traditions than the other Mohicans in the novel. And he has a very green burial at the end. He's buried under a tree, and people mourn him, and people have access to his grave because of where he's buried. And the implication there is, you know, that this settler identity is much more rooted in the land, right? And then comparatively, all the other Indigenous, the majority of the other corpses in the novel are Indigenous characters, and they're described almost like vegetation or background. A lot of them are just left in heaps or masses or groups, and they're categorized based on as uncivilized and just like part of the wilderness. And there's a very different sense of care that's even as characters, where they're not treated the same. And so you start to see that this is establishing what I call corpse ecologies, where bodies have an unequal relationship with the land, and that privileges certain bodies from being given a certain kind of afterlife that other bodies are not afforded. And I think that that's what I found really interesting about these novels. There's a lot of scenes that take place in cemeteries, for instance, and it becomes this kind of reversal of the Indian burial trope in like horror movies, where ordinarily that's when you would have these, that's when you get the new owners who are haunted by the ghosts. And then in these novels, it's the opposite. You have these Indigenous characters who reconcile with settlers in cemeteries and then exit the space of death, as if to say they're not even haunting the space of death anymore. They don't even get an afterlife. And so, and for me, I started just to kind of connect that to a lot of the green burial movement and the promises of an afterlife of a sustainable afterlife that they give their customers, and they do it like a lot of these novels do by sort of invoking these traditions of ancient civilizations who are extinct now, right? So there's this sense that it's okay to do this, to appropriate these practices because, you know,
yeah,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's what's running through my head is that this topic is particularly salient at this time, at a time when many of us are seeing the bodies of Palestinians on our social media feeds, and we're seeing the unequal treatment of death right before us in a colonial setting.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk in the moment right now about the way that media treats Israeli deaths and Palestinian deaths differently. And what your work is showing me is that this is a long history and that this is a common tool of colonialism, of colonial systems, where we see this happening. So, like we're seeing that, we're being told that there are bodies piling up outside of hospitals in Palestine, right, in Gaza, and they're not being afforded. There's no way of giving them a good death right now, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it becomes abstracted and
yes.
faceless. And again, it's very similar to the idea of heaps and groups as once, depending on the formation that you give these deaths and these bodies, you grieve them differently. And that's also a reflection of the kind of value that you ascribe to them, to these bodies in life as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking now that after reading your piece and now having this conversation with you, I feel like when I'm reading literature now, I'm going to be on the lookout. Like how those things pop out at you. Like I'm like, oh, this is the way that this body is being. I feel like I'm going to be hypersensitive and thinking about it more.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very. I think once you start paying attention. I mean, I see it everywhere. I always notice, where the bodies are. I'm always trying to like find the trail. But yeah, they're used in very structural ways that's very interesting when you start to see like what kind of politics are buried in these bodies, right? And once you start kind of exhuming that, there's this whole kind of parallel history that's buried with these bodies that's really interesting to exhume and kind of and think about, right? And how that continues to this day. And once you see this rhetoric being recycled nowadays. And I think that that's how these novels and knowing this history can help us interrogate that and realize that maybe we need better concepts, especially in terms of thinking and dealing about the climate crisis, that we're still kind of abstracting it behind this optimistic universalist language. And that's preventing us from dismantling real inequalities where not everyone has access to this sustainable future.
Yeah. Okay. So you've touched upon it a lot, but let's just like hit it directly as we end this conversation. And the Green Barrel movement it fascinates me. And I follow the Order of the Good Death on on social media and whatnot. So I have thought of how I want my body. I've always never wanted to be buried in a cemetery, partially because that's just not like my family doesn't really do that in the closest, like it's never been like a thing for us. Anyways, so as you've pointed out, the Green Barrel movement is actually in some ways perpetuating these colonial dynamics, even though it's kind of claiming that it's not, but it actually is. So let's, how is it perpetuating these? I
mean, I think that it's, and I don't want to say this for all of that. There are different cemeteries, conservation cemeteries that offer different things. but the majority of them that I've seen, like even when they interview the people who run them, when you go to their websites, when you read books about the Green Burial movement, there tends to be one thing that is very recurrent, and that's they'll talk about returning to the land and the natural burial methods of ancient civilizations, like indigenous people who were previously on the land. And they rehearse the same kind of extinction fantasies, I think, that gives you this sense that this is from a distant past rather than a very present reality, where these, you know, and it also kind of lumps all of these communities together as one monolith indigenous people. Yeah. Like it doesn't kind of differentiate between different tribes, which is also problematic. And it makes you think like, well, who's returning to the land here? Like whose methods, who's doing this reclaiming of these methods? And, you know, who has access to this land? I mean, that still demands having to purchase land in the service of this movement, right? So you're still claiming land, and it's still quite expensive. So it's not accessible to everyone. And it's usually in these communities that are themselves kind of isolated, and you know, so again, it becomes another way of where you start to realize that there are inequities here that this is reproducing, and it reproduces the same kind of logic of land ownership, and it becomes especially, I think, hard to really take seriously when it sits in tension with the desecration of actual indigenous burial sites by like pipeline projects, right? So it became this thing that to me is really kind of becomes really problematic to think about when you have these conservation cemeteries that are using this rhetoric, and at the same time we see that actual indigenous remains are not treated with the same kind of value. And so again, I'm not saying that it's not important to think about green burials and to think about green ways of being buried. I just think that it becomes a distraction from actually thinking about these inequities, and we can't start thinking in universal terms like this when we still have communities who have yet to be humanized enough for us to think of their deaths on with the same kind of value.
Yeah, I think, yeah, as this is a great conversation. Yeah. I have a lot of my mind is racing with all these thoughts. And,
I just think it's also like we don't think about cemetery rights a lot. Yeah. I think we think a lot about our rights to life, our right to certain things, but this is also a question of like who has cemetery rights and who doesn't. And it's very clear that you know, as a settler, your body will be deemed as like healing the earth once it's, you know, this is a future for your future generations. And then meanwhile, you know, they're digging up indigenous cemeteries all over North America, and that's saying that their descendants are not given the same kind of legacy and futurity. They're not part of this sustainable vision that we have.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how like a lot of these burial practices also require a lot of money that, you know, are not going to be, they're not accessible to most indigenous populations, most populations of color, most white populations. Like it's a very classist thing too, I think.
There's a huge disparity between cremation is the most popular form of body disposal because it's the cheapest and it's the one that most people can afford, and it creates the most pollution. So, you know, if you're somebody who can only afford cremation, then that puts out most pollution that affects you the most as a demographic that you know, it's this really weird cycle. And I feel like the focus on green burial is not addressing that there are these inequalities and disparities that we need to address first to make sure that everyone gets to share in this vision of the future. Like you said, it's very expensive now. I think back in the day, like the first time that I remembered hearing anything about green burials was from watching 6 Feet Under, where, you know, spoiler to everyone who's not watched it, but Nate dies and he gets a green burial, but it's not really a thing at the time. So his whole family buries him together, and I don't know I can't remember where they do it, but they just kind of take it upon themselves to do it, and it looks exhausting. And you just say, oh, I don't want to get my family to do this. But I mean, if you do it the NiCHE way, it's free, I guess. But nowadays, yeah, there's land that's been zoned for conservation purposes. And I mean, I think you can go to a lot of their website and see their little blurbs and their missions, and it's really interesting. I think once you start kind of analyzing the language that they use and the tropes, and if you're familiar with the literature or the rural cemetery movement of the 1830s, you start to see that it really hasn't changed much.
Fascinating. Cool. Okay. This was a fantastic discussion.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think it was very thought-provoking and fun on my part, but it's like it's such a serious topic, and it affects everyone. Like no one is
yeah. I hope that's not another spoiler for everyone, but yeah, this is gonna happen to all of us.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for joining me today, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.